The Invisible Man. A man swept floors in the most dangerous place in America, ignored by everyone around him. They mocked him, pushed past him, treated him like he didn't exist. But when chaos erupted and lives hung in the balance, this forgotten janitor would reveal something that would leave hardened criminals speechless. What happened next? Subscribe now to discover a story that will change how you see strength forever. Marcus Webb pushed his mop across the cafeteria floor of Redstone Correctional Facility with the same methodical rhythm he'd maintained for 8 months. Each stroke deliberate, each movement economical. The gray water swirled in patterns that disappeared as quickly as they formed, much like his presence in this place seemed to register with the inmates who surrounded him. "Yo, janitor man, you missed a spot," called out Demetrius Jackson, a muscular inmate with tear tattoos tracking down his left cheek. Laughter erupted from the table where Jackson held court with 5 other men, their breakfast trays still scattered before them. Marcus didn't respond. He simply redirected his mop toward the area Jackson had indicated, his expression neutral, his shoulders relaxed despite the tension that always electrified the air in maximum security. "I think he's deaf," another inmate suggested, flicking a piece of toast onto the freshly cleaned floor. Marcus paused, bent down, picked up the toast with a napkin, deposited it in his rolling trash bin, and resumed mopping. The action took perhaps 10 seconds. His face revealed nothing. No anger, no frustration, no acknowledgement that he'd been deliberately provoked. This was Marcus's daily reality. At 53 years old, he'd become the facility's most overlooked presence. While other inmates jockeyed for status, formed alliances, or navigated the complex hierarchy of prison politics, Marcus simply cleaned. Bathrooms, hallways, the recreation yard. Wherever the administration needed him, he went without complaint. The other inmates had crafted their own mythology around him. Some claimed he was simple-minded. Others suggested he was broken by whatever crime had landed him here. A few believed he was informing to the guards, though no evidence supported this theory. What they all agreed upon was this: Marcus Webb was weak. They measured strength in Redstone by different metrics than the outside world employed. Here, respect came through intimidation, through the willingness to respond to disrespect with immediate violence, through the careful cultivation of a reputation that warned others to keep their distance. Marcus possessed none of these qualities. He woke before dawn, cleaned until lunch, read in his cell during recreation periods while others lifted weights or played basketball, ate dinner alone, slept early. Day after day, the same routine, the same invisible existence. The guards barely noticed him either. To them, Marcus was simply efficient, a model inmate who required no supervision, no intervention, no thought whatsoever. He'd become part of the infrastructure, as forgettable as the cinder block walls. But invisibility, as Marcus understood, was its own form of freedom. Foundations of discipline. What makes a man choose silence when the world demands he react? Before you judge weakness, you need to understand the foundation beneath it. This chapter reveals the hidden architecture of strength that most people never recognize. Keep reading, and hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to learn might transform your own approach to life's challenges. Marcus's cell measured 8 feet by 10 feet, a concrete box he shared with no one, a rare privilege in the overcrowded facility, granted only because his previous cellmate had requested a transfer after 2 weeks of what he described as living with a robot. The space was immaculate. His bunk was made with military precision each morning. The thin blanket stretched tight enough to bounce a quarter. 3 books sat on the small metal shelf, spines aligned perfectly with the edge. Beneath his bunk, his spare uniform was folded into a precise square. Nothing extraneous, nothing wasted. What his fellow inmates didn't know, what they couldn't know from observing his quiet routine, was that Marcus had chosen every element of this existence deliberately. 25 years earlier, Marcus had worn a different uniform, Marine Corps, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. He'd served 2 tours in the Gulf, where he'd learned that survival in chaos required absolute discipline. The Marines hadn't made him strong. They'd revealed a capacity for control he hadn't known he possessed. After his service, he'd spent 15 years as a high school teacher in Detroit. Mathematics. He'd loved the work, loved watching students grasp concepts that had seemed impossible moments before. He'd loved the structure, the daily renewal of purpose, the small victories. Then came the accident. Takes being boring, Carlos suggested. Ghost shook his head slightly. Takes being non-threatening to everybody simultaneously. You know how hard that is? The gangs don't trust neutral. They assume you're gathering intel for someone. But Webb? Nobody worries about him. Marcus passed their cell, his mop creating a rhythmic swishing sound. His eyes focused on the floor, but Ghost noticed something others missed. The slight adjustment in Marcus's position as he moved, always maintaining awareness of the space around him without appearing to look up. He's former military, Ghost said quietly. How you know? The way he stands, the way he moves. But more than that, military teaches you something most people don't understand. It teaches you that your ego doesn't matter. Results matter. The test. Every peaceful man faces a moment when his principles are challenged. This is that moment. What you're about to read will challenge everything you think you know about confrontation and courage. Stay with me, and make sure you're subscribed, because this chapter reveals a truth about human nature that textbooks never teach. The incident began ordinarily enough, at least by prison standards. Marcus was cleaning the shower area in D Block's north wing when 3 inmates entered. He recognized them immediately. Associates of Demetrius Jackson, the man who'd made mocking Marcus something of a daily ritual. Their leader was a thick-bodied man named Trey Williams, serving 20 years for aggravated assault. Marcus continued scrubbing the tile, his movements unchanged by their presence. The shower area was technically off-limits during cleaning hours, but guards rarely enforced this rule strictly. Marcus had learned that intervention on his behalf would be minimal at best. "Janitor man," Trey announced, his voice echoing off the tile walls. "We got a problem." Marcus set down his brush, straightened slowly, and turned to face them. His expression remained neutral, his body language open but not submissive. He said nothing. "You cleaned my cell yesterday," Trey continued, stepping closer. "You went through my stuff." This was false. Marcus never touched personal belongings beyond what was necessary to sweep or mop. He maintained strict boundaries precisely to avoid these accusations, but truth in this moment held little relevance. "I didn't touch anything," Marcus said quietly. His tone carried no challenge, no fear, simple statement of fact. "You calling me a liar?" Trey's voice rose slightly, the ritualized escalation beginning. Marcus understood the dynamic. Trey wasn't actually angry about any alleged invasion of privacy. This was theater, a public test designed to establish dominance. The other 2 inmates were witnesses, their role to spread word of whatever happened next throughout the block. In prison, backing down from such challenges carried consequences. Showing fear invited further targeting. Running would mark him as prey. Fighting, even if he lost, might earn a measure of respect. Marcus did none of these things. "I'm saying I didn't touch your belongings," he repeated, his voice remaining calm. "If something's missing, that's concerning. I can speak with the block sergeant about it if you'd like to file a formal complaint." The response was so unexpected that Trey actually paused. Offering to involve administration wasn't cooperation. Snitching required providing information about other inmates. But suggesting formal channels for a fabricated grievance created a peculiar paradox. "You think I'm playing?" Trey demanded, moving into Marcus's personal space. At 6'3", he towered over Marcus's 5'9" frame. "I think you're trying to determine something," Marcus said evenly. "And I think you should consider what happens next carefully." The statement hung in the air. It wasn't a threat. Marcus's tone remained conversational, almost gentle. But something in the way he held himself, in the complete absence of visible tension, created uncertainty. Trey's hand shot out, shoving Marcus backward. The older man absorbed the push, taking 2 steps back to maintain balance rather than resisting the force. He reset his stance, still facing Trey, his hands visible and open at his sides. "You're not going to do nothing," Trey said, but the declaration sounded less certain now. "No," Marcus agreed simply. "I'm not going to fight you." "Then you're a coward." "Perhaps." Marcus's acknowledgement of the possibility contained no shame, no defensiveness. "But consider, you're about to beat up a 53-year-old janitor who hasn't resisted. How does that play? Marcus had been driving home from a parent-teacher conference on a rainy November evening. A young man, 19 years old, legally intoxicated, had run a red light at 45 miles per hour. The impact had been catastrophic. Marcus's wife, Sarah, sitting in the passenger seat, had died before the ambulance arrived. The young man had survived without serious injury. For 6 months afterward, Marcus had functioned on autopilot, teaching, grading papers, existing in the hollow space where his life had been. Friends had called it grief. His therapist had called it complicated bereavement. Marcus had called it nothing, because naming it would have required acknowledging the rage that burned beneath his carefully maintained surface. The young man's name was Kyle Peterson. His family had hired expensive attorneys. The sentence was light, 2 years, with possibility of parole after 10 months. Vehicular manslaughter while intoxicated. The judge had spoken about rehabilitation, about second chances, about how one mistake shouldn't define a young life. Marcus had sat in the courtroom and said nothing. 3 weeks after the sentencing, Marcus had driven to Kyle Peterson's apartment. He'd knocked on the door. When Kyle answered, Marcus had hit him once, a single controlled strike that broke the young man's jaw in 2 places. Then Marcus had called the police himself. The assault charge had been straightforward. Marcus had a clean record, but he'd acted with premeditation. He'd driven across town specifically to commit violence. The prosecutor had pushed for the maximum sentence. Marcus's attorney had argued for leniency, citing his military service, his spotless teaching career, his profound loss. The judge had given him 5 years. The hierarchy of power. Inside these walls, respect is currency, and violence is language. But what happens when someone refuses to speak that language? In this chapter, witness how true power operates in spaces where most people see only brutality. Don't skip ahead. Subscribe to follow this journey, because understanding this principle could change how you navigate every difficult relationship in your life. Redstone Correctional Facility housed 1,100 inmates across 4 separate blocks. D Block, where Marcus resided, held the maximum security population. Men convicted of violent crimes. Men with extensive records. Men whom the system had categorized as requiring the highest level of containment. The unofficial hierarchy had been established long before Marcus arrived. At the top sat the gang leadership. The Aryan Brotherhood controlled the western cells. The Black Guerrilla family dominated the eastern corridor, and the Mexican Mafia held the southern section. These groups maintained an uneasy equilibrium, their territories respected through the implicit threat of coordinated violence. Beneath the gang leadership existed various independent operators, men whose personal reputations provided protection without formal affiliation. These inmates had typically earned their status through prison fights, through demonstrated willingness to respond to any challenge with immediate and overwhelming force. Below them were the general population inmates who aligned themselves with protective groups, offering loyalty or services in exchange for safety. And at the very bottom existed the vulnerable, the elderly, the weak, the suspected informants, the sex offenders segregated in protective custody. Marcus occupied a category that defied this structure entirely. He wasn't protected by gang affiliation. He hadn't established a reputation for violence. He possessed neither the youth nor the physical presence that might have deterred casual aggression. By every logical assessment, he should have been targeted within his first week. Yet 8 months had passed, and while inmates regularly mocked him, nobody had actually attacked him. This anomaly hadn't gone unnoticed by those who paid attention to such patterns. Raymond "Ghost" Miller was one such observer. At 38, Ghost served a 15-year sentence for armed robbery. He'd earned his nickname through an ability to move through the prison's social landscape without creating ripples, gathering information, identifying opportunities. Ghost understood that knowledge was power, and he'd become increasingly curious about the janitor who seemed to violate all established rules without consequence. "You ever notice how Webb moves?" Ghost asked his cellmate, a younger inmate named Carlos who was still learning prison dynamics. Carlos shrugged. "The janitor? Dude's nobody. Why you care?" "That's what interests me," Ghost replied, watching Marcus through the cell bars as the older man mopped the corridor outside. "In here, nobody is invisible unless they choose to be. And staying invisible while cleaning cells for the AB, the BGF, and the EME, That takes something. The calculation. What happens when someone refuses to play by the established rules? In spaces where violence determines value, voluntary vulnerability becomes its own weapon. This chapter unlocks a principle that might seem counterintuitive, but it's one of the most powerful strategies for diffusing conflict. Subscribe now, because you'll want to remember this lesson when you face your own confrontations. The standoff in the shower area had reached its critical moment. Trey Williams stood inches from Marcus, his fists clenched, his breathing heavy. Behind him, his two associates watched with increasing uncertainty. This wasn't unfolding according to the expected script. Prison fights typically followed predictable patterns. The target would either submit immediately, dropping eye contact, apologizing, demonstrating clear subordination, or they'd escalate, returning aggression with aggression, transforming the confrontation into a test of will and strength. Marcus had done neither. His refusal to fight wasn't submission. He hadn't apologized or begged. But his calm acceptance of vulnerability had created something more unsettling than defiance. It had created a question without a satisfying answer. Trey's reputation depended on his willingness to employ violence in response to disrespect. But Marcus hadn't shown disrespect. He'd simply stated facts. He hadn't touched Trey's belongings, and beating him wouldn't change that reality. More significantly, Marcus had identified the game itself, had spoken aloud the social calculation that was supposed to remain implicit. "You think you're smart," Trey said, but his voice had lost some of its aggressive edge. "I think I'm practical," Marcus replied. "You can hit me. I won't stop you. But afterward, you'll have established that you can hurt a man who won't defend himself, and I'll still be cleaning these showers tomorrow." From the doorway, a new voice interrupted. "Problem here?" Officer Hendricks, a 20-year veteran of corrections, stood at the entrance to the shower area. His timing suggested he'd been observing for at least several seconds before announcing his presence, standard procedure for guards who understood that intervention timing mattered as much as intervention itself. "No problem, boss," Trey said, stepping back from Marcus. "Just having a conversation." Hendricks's eyes moved from Trey to Marcus. "Webb? Everything okay?" "Yes, sir," Marcus said. "Just discussing some concerns about cell cleanliness." The guard's expression suggested he understood exactly what had been happening, but he also recognized that Marcus wasn't asking for help. "Williams, you and your friends need to be somewhere else. Webb's got work to do." As the three inmates filed past Hendricks, Trey paused briefly. "We ain't done," he said to Marcus, quiet enough that the guard wouldn't clearly hear. "I'll be right here tomorrow," Marcus replied, equally quiet. After they'd gone, Hendricks lingered. "You know they're going to keep testing you." "I know," Marcus acknowledged, picking up his cleaning brush. "You served, didn't you?" "I can tell." Marcus glanced up briefly. "Marines. Long time ago." "Then you know how to handle yourself." It was a statement, not a question. "I do," Marcus confirmed. "And that's why I'm handling it this way." Hendricks considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Your call. But if things escalate, you let me know." "Thank you, officer." After Hendricks departed, Marcus returned to scrubbing the tile. His hands were steady, his breathing normal. The confrontation had elevated his heart rate slightly, but nothing approaching panic or anger. He'd meant what he said. He would be here tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. What Trey and his associates didn't understand, what most people in this environment couldn't grasp, was that Marcus had already survived the worst thing that could happen to him. Sarah's death had broken something fundamental in his understanding of the world. The violence that had landed him here had been his attempt to impose order on chaos, to make the universe acknowledge his pain through action. It hadn't worked. Kyle Peterson's broken jaw hadn't brought Sarah back, hadn't eased Marcus's grief, hadn't provided the satisfaction he'd imagined it might. The gathering storm's stability in confined spaces is always temporary. Tensions build beneath calm surfaces, and when they erupt, everyone gets tested. This chapter shows you what happens when the careful balance Marcus has maintained faces its greatest challenge. Keep reading and subscribe if you haven't yet. Because crisis reveals character in ways comfort never can. 3 weeks after the shower incident, the atmosphere in D Block began to shift. The change was subtle at first, conversations ending abruptly when certain inmates walked past, groups clustering more tightly during recreation periods, a general tightening of the social fabric that preceded violence. Marcus noticed because noticing was how he survived. The casual observer might have missed the signs, but casual observation was a luxury no one in prison could afford. Something was building, though its nature remained unclear. The catalyst, as Ghost later explained to him, was business. Inside Redstone, as in most prisons, an underground economy flourished. Contraband, drugs primarily, but also cell phones, alcohol, and various other prohibited items, moved through carefully controlled channels. These channels were managed by the gangs, who maintained their monopolies through threat of force. Recently, someone had been undercutting the established prices, not dramatically, but enough to redirect significant business. Worse, the source remained unidentified. The 3 major gangs had each conducted internal investigations and found nothing. The possibility that an outside actor was somehow facilitating this disruption was creating paranoia. When organizations built on violence become paranoid, casualties become inevitable. Marcus observed the increasing tension during his daily rounds. In the Aryan Brotherhood section, conversations stopped when he approached. The Mexican Mafia's members watched everyone with new suspicion. The Black Guerrilla family had increased their visible presence in common areas, a territorial assertion. "You're going to want to stay in your cell more," Ghost advised him one evening. They'd developed a routine of occasionally sitting together in the library, engaging in minimal conversation that both men found comfortable. "Can't," Marcus replied. "I have work assignments. Talk to the guards. Tell them you're sick. Something. And next week? Next month? Eventually, I have to be out here. Hiding doesn't solve anything." Ghost studied him. "You know something's about to happen. I know tension when I see it. And you're just going to keep mopping floors?" "That's what they pay me for," Marcus said with the faintest hint of humor. But even Marcus couldn't have predicted what happened next. It began in the cafeteria during lunch service. Marcus was at the far end of the room, emptying trash bins, when raised voices erupted near the food line. 2 inmates, one affiliated with the AB, one with the BGF, were facing each other over what appeared to be a minor collision. A dropped tray. Spilled food. The kind of incident that happened daily without consequence. Except this time, both men's organizations were primed for conflict. The minor collision became an accusation. The accusation became a push. The push became the match that lit accumulated tension. The fight spread with terrible speed. Within 30 seconds, 20 inmates were involved. Within a minute, that number had doubled. The guards' initial attempts at intervention were overwhelmed. The alarm sounded. A piercing mechanical shriek that meant lockdown, backup, emergency response. Marcus moved immediately toward the cafeteria's exit, along with other uninvolved inmates who recognized the wisdom of distance. But halfway to the door, he stopped. An inmate had gone down near the center of the chaos, an older man named Robert Sanchez, who worked in the kitchen. Robert wasn't affiliated with any gang, wasn't part of the beef. He'd simply been in the wrong place when violence erupted. Now he was on the ground, being trampled by the surging crowd. Marcus watched for 3 seconds, calculating. The guards were focused on the main combat, trying to separate the primary combatants. No one had noticed Robert. In perhaps 30 seconds, the Riot response team would arrive with shields and batons and chemical agents. Until then, Robert Sanchez was going to be seriously injured or killed. Every rational instinct told Marcus to keep moving toward the exit. This wasn't his problem. Robert wasn't his friend. Entering that chaos meant accepting serious risk for a man he barely knew. The smart play, the safe play, was obvious. Marcus turned and walked directly into the Riot. The spreading awareness word travels fast in closed systems, but interpretation varies widely. What some see as weakness, others recognize as strategy. In this chapter, the prison's power brokers begin to understand that the quiet janitor might be playing a different game entirely. Don't miss this shift. Subscribe to stay with the story, because recognizing strategic thinking when you see it is a crucial life skill. The shower incident spread through D-Block within hours, as Marcus knew it would. In prison, information traveled through an informal network more efficient than any official communication system. But the story's retelling revealed something interesting. Multiple versions emerged, each reflecting the teller's own framework for understanding power. Demetrius Jackson heard the version where his associate Trey had punked the janitor, making him acknowledge that he was nothing. This version satisfied Jackson's need to see the established hierarchy reinforced. The Aryan Brotherhood's leadership heard a version where Trey had been played, where the janitor had used some kind of psychological manipulation to avoid a beating while making Trey look uncertain. This version interested them because uncertainty was weakness in their worldview. Ghost Miller heard the most accurate version, gleaned from multiple sources and his own careful observation. He understood that Marcus had done something more sophisticated than either winning or losing. He'd changed the framework of the confrontation entirely. He's using principles most of these fools don't recognize, Ghost explained to Carlos that evening. They sat in their cell during the rec period, watching the block's social dynamics play out below in the common area. What principles? Carlos asked, genuinely curious now. Non-resistance, but not submission. It's like... Ghost searched for the right analogy. You know how when you push against a door and it suddenly opens, you stumble forward? That's what he's doing. Everyone in here is pushing, expecting resistance. Webb just opens the door. That's some Zen master stuff, Carlos said skeptically. Maybe. Or maybe it's just someone who's got nothing left to prove to anybody. In another part of the block, a different conversation was taking place. Antonio Ruiz, second in command of the Mexican Mafia's prison chapter, sat across from his lieutenant discussing the janitor situation. Should we be concerned? The lieutenant asked. Ruiz shook his head. He's not a threat. If anything, he's useful. The man cleans everywhere, sees everything, and says nothing. That's valuable. But if he's gathering intelligence... For who? Ruiz interrupted. The guards. They don't need his intelligence. They have cameras and informants already. The other gangs? None of them trust him enough to use him. No. This man is exactly what he appears to be. Someone doing his time as quietly as possible. Then why did Trey back off? This question gave Ruiz pause. That's the interesting part. Trey backed off because Webb made him think, made him calculate. In a place where most reactions are instinctive, someone who makes you stop and calculate has a different kind of power. Meanwhile, Marcus was in the prison library, a small room with outdated books and a few ancient computers restricted to legal research. He sat at a table in the corner, reading a book about Stoic philosophy that he'd read 3 times already. The words of Marcus Aurelius resonated differently each time. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Mind if I sit? A voice asked. Marcus looked up to find Ghost Miller standing nearby, holding a book of his own, something about business strategy, incongruous in this setting. It's a public table, Marcus replied neutrally. Ghost sat down, but didn't open his book immediately. That thing with Trey. That was smart. Marcus returned his attention to his own book. I don't know what you mean. Yeah, you do, but that's fine. We don't need to talk about it. Ghost paused. I'm curious about something, though. No obligation to answer. But why janitorial? You could have worked in the kitchen, the library, the shop. Quieter places. For a moment, Marcus considered not responding. But something about Ghost's approach, direct without being aggressive, prompted him to engage. Janitorial means I'm everywhere. Kitchen would have put me in one gang's territory. Library is too comfortable. Shop requires specialized skills I'd have to learn. Janitorial is democratic. Ghost smiled slightly. Democratic. That's one word for it. It means I'm not valuable enough to any one group to be worth claiming, but not threatening enough to any group to be worth eliminating. Like I said, smart. They sat in silence for several minutes, both men reading. It was, in its way, the beginning of something neither would have named friendship. Too strong a word for this environment. But perhaps mutual respect. The choice. True character emerges not in comfortable moments but in impossible choices. What you're about to read will define everything that came before it. This is why you started this journey. Subscribe now to ensure you see how it resolves. Because this chapter contains a lesson about courage that most people spend their whole lives avoiding. The cacophony of the riot was overwhelming. Shouting, the impact of bodies colliding, the distinctive sounds of violence conducted with desperate intensity. Marcus moved through it with singular focus, his eyes locked on Robert Sanchez's position approximately 30 feet away. The Marine Corps had trained him for chaos. Not this specific chaos, but the principle remained. Identify your objective, chart the most direct path, adjust in real time. His objective was Robert. The path required navigating between groups of fighting inmates without becoming a target himself. Marcus moved along the edge of the violence, not through its center. When a struggling pair of inmates stumbled toward him, he sidestepped smoothly, using their momentum to create space rather than resisting their mass. When another inmate swung wildly in his direction, a blind strike with no specific target, Marcus dropped low, letting the fist pass over him. 20 feet from Robert now. The older man had curled into a defensive position, arms protecting his head, but feet continued to strike him as the fight churned around his position. Marcus could see blood on the floor, source unclear, possibly Robert's, possibly from one of the combatants above him. 15 feet. A guard's voice crackled over the PA system, demanding compliance, threatening consequences. The threats were meaningless in this moment. The violence had its own momentum now, fed by adrenaline and long-simmering grievances that had found explosive outlet. 10 feet. Marcus passed directly behind Demetrius Jackson, who was grappling with a Mexican mafia associate. Neither man noticed him. Their entire world had narrowed to their mutual struggle for dominance. 5 feet. Marcus dropped to his knees beside Robert, his body shielding the older man from some of the surrounding chaos. "Robert," he said urgently, "we need to move." "Can you stand?" Robert's eyes, previously squeezed shut, opened. Recognition, confusion, and fear played across his face in rapid succession. "I can't. My leg." Marcus didn't wait for complete sentences. He hooked his hands under Robert's arms and began dragging him backward, away from the densest concentration of violence, toward the relative safety of the wall. Robert helped as much as he could, using his good leg to push while Marcus pulled. They'd covered perhaps 6 feet when someone grabbed Marcus's shoulder from behind. Instinct took over, a reflexive movement that broke the grip and created distance. Marcus turned to find Trey Williams, the man who'd confronted him in the shower weeks earlier. Blood streamed from a cut above Trey's eye. His expression was wild, the careful control of prison politics replaced by something more primal. For a frozen moment, Marcus thought he'd have to fight, and if he fought, he couldn't protect Robert. Then Trey's eyes focused, recognition cutting through his adrenaline haze. He saw Marcus. He saw Robert. He understood what was happening. "Go," Trey said, and turned away, putting himself between Marcus and the fighting. The unexpected assistance allowed Marcus to drag Robert the remaining distance to the wall. He positioned them in a corner, the most defensible location, limiting approach angles. Robert's leg was clearly broken, the shin bent at an unnatural angle. "Stay down," Marcus instructed. "Cover your head. This will end soon." The riot response team crashed through the cafeteria doors with military precision. 12 officers in full protective gear, moving in a coordinated line. They deployed chemical agents first, pepper spray that turned the air into razors. Then they engaged physically, separating combatants, forcing inmates to the ground, establishing control through overwhelming force. Marcus stayed in position, shielding Robert, his own eyes streaming from the chemical agents, his throat constricted. An officer approached, baton raised, shouting commands. Marcus raised his hands, palms visible, making himself clearly non-threatening. "He's injured," Marcus called out, indicating Robert. "Broken leg. He needs medical." The officer assessed the situation rapidly, recognizing that neither man posed a threat. He keyed his radio. "We need medical to the cafeteria. 1 inmate down, probable fracture." The riot ended the way most prison riots ended, not with resolution but with exhaustion and superior force. Inmates were secured, sorted, searched. The injured were identified and treated. The instigators were isolated for disciplinary proceedings. Marcus and Robert were among the last processed. Because neither had participated in the fighting, They avoided the immediate lockdown that would confine the active participants to their cells for the coming investigation. Robert was transported to the medical unit. Marcus was questioned briefly, provided a clear and factual account of events, and released back to his cell. The aftermath. Actions create ripples that travel further than we anticipate. What Marcus did, and why he did it, resonates through the prison's social structure in unexpected ways. Subscribe to see how this chapter resolves a story that began with humiliation and transforms into something profound. This is the wisdom you've been waiting for. The investigation into the cafeteria riot took 3 days. During that time, D Block remained on modified lockdown, inmates confined to cells except for brief recreation periods in small supervised groups. The tension that had preceded the violence had dissipated, replaced by a collective exhaustion. Whatever conflict the riot had supposedly addressed, it had resolved nothing except to demonstrate that the administration could still impose order through force. Marcus spent the lockdown reading, a routine so established that the extraordinary events of the previous days barely disturbed it. But on the 4th day, when normal operations resumed, he discovered that something fundamental had shifted in the prison's social dynamics. He noticed it first in the cafeteria. As he entered to begin his cleaning duties, conversations continued. Inmates didn't fall silent at his approach, but more significantly, they acknowledged him. Brief nods, occasional, "Hey Webb" greetings, a level of recognition that had been entirely absent before. Demetrius Jackson, who'd made mocking Marcus a daily ritual, approached him directly. "Need to talk to you," Jackson said, his tone neither friendly nor hostile, simply matter of fact. Marcus set down his mop. "All right. What you did?" "With Robert. That was..." Jackson searched for the right word. "That was solid." "He needed help," Marcus replied simply. "Yeah, but most people wouldn't have gone in there. Hell, I wouldn't have gone in there if it wasn't my problem." Jackson paused. "I've been disrespecting you." That was wrong. The apology was unexpected. In prison, admissions of error were rare. They could be perceived as weakness, as invitation for exploitation. For someone of Jackson's status to make this statement publicly carried significant meaning. "I appreciate that," Marcus said. "You were military," Jackson stated. It wasn't a question. Somehow, despite Marcus's careful obscurity, this information had circulated. "Marines." "That explains some things." Jackson extended his hand. Marcus shook it, a brief, firm grip that signified the establishment of mutual respect. "You need anything, you let me know." After Jackson departed, Ghost appeared, as if he'd been waiting for the interaction to conclude. "You've become a person of interest," he observed. "I'd rather not be," Marcus admitted. "Too late. You violated the first rule of prison invisibility. You did something memorable." Ghost's tone carried amusement. "The story's all over the facility now. Different versions, of course, but the core's consistent. Quiet janitor walks into a riot to save somebody who can't save himself. It wasn't that dramatic. Doesn't matter. Stories become what people need them to be. And right now, people need a story about someone doing the right thing for no personal benefit." Over the following week, Marcus observed the continuing ripples. Robert Sanchez, recovering in the medical unit, had spread his own version of events to the kitchen workers, who then shared it throughout their networks. Trey Williams had told his associates about stepping aside to let Marcus help Robert, an action that, in retrospect, had saved Trey from having to choose between maintaining his aggressive reputation and doing the obviously right thing. The guards, too, had taken note. Officer Hendricks approached Marcus during a routine cleaning assignment in the administrative corridor. "Webb, got a minute?" Hendricks gestured toward an empty interview room. Inside, Hendricks closed the door and spoke candidly. "What you did in the cafeteria, that was good work. Potentially saved that man's life." "I hope so," Marcus replied. "The warden's office is considering a commendation. Might help with your parole board review when the time comes." Marcus nodded but said nothing. His sentence was 5 years. He'd served only 10 months. Parole considerations remained distant. Hendricks studied him. "You know, most inmates here are trying to survive their time. Some are trying to run their time, establish dominance, make money, expand influence. You're doing something different. You're trying to serve your time. I'm trying to do the time I earned, Marcus clarified. I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. That's why I'm here. Accepting that is the only way forward. The man you assaulted. Kyle Peterson. You know his family dropped the restraining order 2 months ago? This was news to Marcus. After his sentencing, the Peterson family had obtained a protective order preventing Marcus from any contact with them upon release. Why? Marcus asked. Peterson himself requested it. He's been sending letters to the facility. They're in your file if you want to read them. Hendricks chose his words carefully. He says he understands now why you did what you did. Says he deserved it. Says he wants to apologize when you're released. Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the recognition that forgiveness might eventually be possible. I'll think about that. Do. In the meantime, keep being the person you've been here. It matters. The quiet resolution. True strength doesn't announce itself through domination. It reveals itself through consistent principle under pressure. This final chapter brings full circle a journey that began with mockery and transforms into wisdom. Thank you for subscribing and staying with this story. What you've learned here about discipline, dignity, and unexpected courage might be the most valuable lesson you encounter this year. 6 months after the cafeteria riot, Marcus Webb stood in the same space where the violence had erupted, methodically mopping the floor in the early morning quiet. His routine had remained unchanged. Wake before dawn, work until lunch, read during recreation, sleep early. But the context of that routine had transformed entirely. He was no longer invisible. Inmates acknowledged him not with fear or formal deference, but with the casual respect granted to someone whose character had been tested and proven. The mocking had ceased entirely, replaced by occasional requests for advice, for perspective, for the kind of wisdom that came from having survived genuine loss without losing one's fundamental humanity. Robert Sanchez had recovered, though he walked with a permanent limp now. He'd been reassigned to library duties, less physically demanding than kitchen work. He and Marcus had developed a genuine friendship, eating together occasionally, discussing books, existing in companionable silence. Ghost Miller had become something like a protege, though neither man would have used that term. Their library sessions continued, but now Ghost asked questions about maintaining discipline, about managing emotion, about finding purpose in confinement. Marcus answered when he could, demurred when he couldn't, and found in these exchanges a purpose he hadn't anticipated. Even the gang leadership had, in their way, come to value Marcus's presence. He remained neutral, but his neutrality was now understood as principled rather than weak. The Aryan Brotherhood's senior member had once stopped him to say simply, "You're good people, Webb." From such men, this qualified as profound endorsement. The warden had indeed issued a formal commendation, which had been entered into Marcus's file. More significantly, the parole board had taken notice. His counselor had informed him that he was being considered for early release after serving 3 years instead of 5, contingent on continued good behavior. But the most significant change had occurred internally. Marcus had arrived at Redstone Correctional Facility carrying rage he couldn't acknowledge and grief he couldn't process. He'd thought that punishing Kyle Peterson would address both. It hadn't. The violence had simply created more violence, had landed him here, had solved nothing. The path forward hadn't come through more violence. It had come through its opposite, through the deliberate choice to be useful rather than dominant, helpful rather than aggressive, present rather than reactive. The cafeteria riot had crystallized this principle. The moment when every instinct said, "Protect yourself," was exactly when character demanded, "Help someone else." On this particular morning, as Marcus worked his way across the cafeteria floor, he found himself thinking about Kyle Peterson's letters. He'd finally read them the previous week, 3 letters written over the course of 8 months. The progression they documented was remarkable, from defensive justification to genuine remorse, to something approaching understanding of the grief that had motivated Marcus's assault. The most recent letter had included a photograph, Kyle standing beside a speaker's podium at what appeared to be a high school. He'd become an advocate for victims' rights, speaking to students about drunk driving, about consequences, about the permanent harm caused by temporary choices. The work didn't absolve him, the letter acknowledged, but it gave meaning to what had happened. Marcus had written back, his first communication with Kyle since that night he'd broken the young man's jaw. The letter had been brief. Your work with students is important. Continue it. When I'm released, we should speak, not to revisit the past, but to acknowledge that we both have to move forward from it. Respectfully, Marcus Webb. The reply had arrived yesterday. Mr. Webb, I would welcome that conversation. I'm grateful for your response, and I'm grateful you're still here to respond. The man I was 3 years ago deserved what you did to me. I'm trying to become someone who deserves your forgiveness instead. Kyle Marcus finished mopping the cafeteria's east side and moved his bucket toward the west. The rising sun through the high windows cast long shadows across the floor, geometric patterns that would disappear within the hour as the light shifted. Officer Hendricks appeared in the doorway. Webb, got someone here to see you. Visitors were rare. Marcus's parents had both passed years ago. He had a sister in California who'd written occasionally but never visited. He followed Hendricks to the visiting area, curious. The visitor was a woman in her 40s, professionally dressed. She introduced herself as Sarah Martinez, an attorney with the Innocence Project. Mr. Webb, I'm here about something unusual. Kyle Peterson has asked me to look into expediting your parole process. He's prepared to make a statement to the board about the transformative impact of his experience, including your assault on him. Marcus absorbed this information slowly. Why would he do that? Because he believes you made a mistake, attacking him, but that mistake doesn't define you. And because he believes that the work you've been doing here, the person you've been here, demonstrates genuine rehabilitation. That's generous of him. Is it something you'd want? Early parole consideration? Marcus considered the question carefully. Part of him, the part that still carried Marine discipline, believed in serving the full sentence he'd been given. But another part recognized that Sarah, were she alive, would want him to accept help when it was offered, to move forward, rather than punishing himself through rigid adherence to pride. Yes, he said finally. I would accept that. The parole hearing occurred 3 months later. Marcus appeared before the board wearing the same calm demeanor he'd maintained throughout his incarceration. He answered their questions directly, acknowledged his crime without excuse, and described with quiet precision the process of understanding that had occurred during his confinement. The board deliberated for 40 minutes. When they returned, the chairwoman spoke. Mr. Webb, this board recognizes that you committed a serious assault motivated by profound grief. We also recognize that you've demonstrated genuine remorse. You've contributed positively to the facility where you've been incarcerated, and you've shown through consistent action that you understand the gravity of your offense. Based on these factors, and considering the victim's own advocacy on your behalf, we're granting early parole, effective in 60 days. 60 days later, Marcus walked out of Redstone Correctional Facility carrying a small bag of personal possessions. Ghost Miller had given him a book, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, the same text Marcus had been reading the first day they'd sat together in the library. Inside, Ghost had written, "The impediment to action advances action. You taught me what that means. Stay strong." Kyle Peterson was waiting in the parking lot. The two men studied each other for a long moment. The older man whose grief had motivated violence, the younger man whose mistake had caused that grief. Then, simultaneously, they both extended their hands. The handshake lasted several seconds. "Thank you," Marcus said. "I should be thanking you," Kyle replied. "What happened, all of it, gave me a chance to become someone better. I'm taking that chance." "So am I," Marcus agreed. They spoke for 20 minutes, standing beside Kyle's car in the autumn sunshine. They made plans to meet monthly, to continue the dialogue, to transform their shared trauma into something approaching redemption. It wouldn't be easy. Both men acknowledged that. But difficulty, as Marcus had learned, was simply the impediment that advanced action. Driving away from the prison, Marcus thought about the path that had led him here. From Marine to teacher, from teacher to grieving husband, from grieving husband to inmate, from inmate to janitor, from janitor to something that defied simple categorization. Someone who'd learned that strength without discipline was just violence, that pride without purpose was just ego, and that the hardest battles were fought not against external enemies, but against the desire for revenge that turned victims into perpetrators. He thought about the men still inside Redstone, Ghost, Robert, even Demetrius Jackson and Trey Williams, who were serving their own time, fighting their own battles, learning or failing to learn the lessons their confinement offered. He thought about Sarah, gone now for 4 years, and allowed himself to believe she would be proud of the man her death had ultimately forced him to become, not through the violence he'd committed, but through the discipline he'd chosen afterward. The road ahead extended into possibility. Marcus Webb, 55 years old, released early from prison, driving toward an uncertain future, felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the desperate hope that circumstances would change without effort, but the disciplined hope that came from understanding that change required consistent action, that redemption was earned through daily choice, and that strength revealed itself not through domination, but through the courage to be vulnerable, to help when helping was difficult, to maintain principle when abandoning it would be easier. He drove toward that future with the same methodical focus he'd applied to mopping floors, 1 mile at a time, one choice at a time, building through incremental action the life he'd lost and, perhaps, deserved to reclaim. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. The end. Thank you for reading this complete story. If you found value in Marcus's journey from humiliation to redemption, please subscribe to receive more narratives exploring themes of discipline, resilience, and the quiet strength that emerges from principled action. Share this story with someone who needs to understand that true power comes not from dominance, but from unwavering commitment to one's principles, even, especially, when no one is watching.